All right, I say we go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for joining us on this fourth Thursday of the month. I'm Amanda Forys. I'm the managing partner here at Magnolia Market Access. And we, as you know, if you're dialing in, we'd like to offer this webinar series, Navigating Market Access with Magnolia, to clients, friends in industry, even competitors who want to come and just learn more about what's going on in the world. Our goal is for this to not be salesy or anything. We just want to bring experts to you and information to you so that you can learn more about what's going on in our world. The topics change monthly. We hit up policy issues, health economics issues, reimbursement issues, anything really related to getting product out the door to a patient, and all of the different things that can come in and affect that. So today we wanted to bring some great colleagues and experts to you all to really talk about what is going on right now with drug pricing and with tariffs. I know when Donald Trump became President Trump Part 2, there's been a lot of flurry in Washington, D.C., and we've been hearing a lot of these terms and just kind of a lot of wait and see of how these things are actually going to be implemented. If implemented, or what's going to happen, we don't know. But I think it is really important for us to talk through what all of these different issues mean, how they come together, and what we should be expecting in the future. I personally will admit I know absolutely nothing about tariffs, and all of a sudden I've had to learn about a whole new topic. So it's been really interesting for me, and I think a lot of people feel the same way in pharma, that it's just not an area that we've done too much work in as an industry. I've been consulting for, I'm going to cover my mouth and say how many years, a long time, and I've never had a discussion with a client about tariffs. So I think today, just seeing how that all ties together and what that means for drug pricing and drug availability is very important. So I am your MC today. Please feel free to type questions into the chat. I will kind of interrupt the panel every now and then and pop a question in. We welcome anything that you'd like to know. Do not be shy. And without further ado, I will turn this over to our great panel. So Tracy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Amanda. You want to switch the slide? There you go. So here are our speakers today. You met Amanda. Many of you probably know me as a frequent participant and presenter in the webinars, but we also have with us David Murphy, who is a partner and an expert in tariffs, partner at GDLSK, and then Chris Schott, who joins us periodically, who is a partner at Latham & Watkins, who will talk about MFN and pricing policies. Next slide, please. Here's our agenda. We'll talk a little bit about current policies and their effectiveness and the impact. Then we'll move on to most favored nation, which we're just going to call MFN for the rest of the time. Next, we're going to talk about the most beautiful word, which is tariffs. And I, like Amanda, will admit that I've worked very little with tariffs. As a matter of fact, I spent about the first 2 months of the tariff discussion trying to remember if it was 1 R and 2 Fs or 2 Rs and 1 F. So, and that's pretty bad considering I'm a pretty good speller, actually. And then we welcome discussion after our individual discussions with the experts as we have time. Next slide, please. Next slide. So when we hear in the atmosphere that drug discounts don't exist in the US, it's important to recognize that they do. And so the first place that I thought it made sense to start was with the Medicare MFP discounts. And while they haven't taken effect yet, the process was put in place. The first year for iPay 2026 is in the books, as they say. And this slide does a good job showing what the discounts are. And so we look at this and we recognize that the discounts were anywhere from a range of 38 to 79% off of WAC prices, with an average of 63%. CMS estimated that these reductions would have saved Medicare $6 billion in 2023, with beneficiaries saving an additional $1.5 billion. And so as this process gets implemented, there will be an ever increasing number of Medicare beneficiaries who have access to discounted drugs, and obviously a growing number of drugs that will have MFPs. When we look at this list, it's also interesting, and I always have to recognize that Stelara actually has biosimilars on the market now. And yet they were identified for negotiation. They went through the process. They now have a negotiated price, which means that price actually will take effect in 2026 for 1 year. And then it will not be valid anymore. And yet we have plans that will have a choice of whether to cover the biosimilars, one of the 7 that will be marketed by the end of 2025, or to cover Stelara. So I think that, kind of the point there is CMS may need to refine their selection process for the future. Otherwise, you get drugs that are caught up in this, losing sales for biosimilars, losing margin because of a negotiated price, and it just cycles on and on. Next slide, please, Amanda. Another group or groups of people who have access to mandated discounts are Medicaid and 340B. Now, as many of you recognize, these are not separate similar programs. 340B, the prices are given to the entities that purchase the drugs, whereas with Medicaid, they are actually given as a mandated rebate that is done retroactively after the drug is dispensed. As of January of 2025, there were 78 million people enrolled in Medicaid, including about 7 million in CHIP and 71 million in regular Medicaid. And about 48% of all these enrollees are actually children overall in Medicaid, and then, of course, in CHIP. There's a decrease of enrollment of 7.5% in 2024, and another decrease of enrollment because of the unwinding of the ACA protections of over 4% in 2025. And yet we still see that there's a significant gross spend, and there are 48 states that are listed in that Medicaid bar that actually get supplemental rebates, which is why you see the rebate percent higher within Medicaid, with about a 51% discount in 2023, and 340B getting about a 40% discount. Again, administered differently, but mandated discounts. Next slide, please. And under the Affordable Care Act, the uninsured population in the United States is at a record low, with only 7.9% of the approximately 330 million people in the United States being uninsured. And while rebates and rebate types vary by type of insurance, it's important to note that only that 7.9% of the population has no access to an actual manufacturer discount. They might have a good RX type discount, which is more of a discount off of the retail price that's done through participating pharmacies, but they don't have a manufacturer discount. And yet over 22% have access to mandated discounts, we see in the lower bottom. And almost 70% have access to negotiated discounts. Now, we all recognize that some, maybe none, maybe all of those discounts are passed through, but the discounts are built into the system for almost all utilization. Next slide, please. And so we're going to look a little bit at what the executive order creates as MFN, and then we're going to talk to Chris about how we got here and where we're going. Next slide, please. According to the executive order requiring most favored nation pricing, the United States will be getting the lowest price negotiated with any country that has a per capita gross domestic product of equal or greater than 60% of the United States GDP. So that's gross domestic product. The US per capita GDP is about $83,000 a year in 2024. And so 60% of that is about $49,800. And the countries you see here are the ones that, as of 2025, would be included in that list. A lot of variation, some of them not surprising, some of them to me more surprising. Israel seems surprising to me. Iceland seems surprising. So these are the countries that manufacturers will be looking at to see what their lowest price is of those included, and also that that the government, the administration will be looking at as well. Next slide, please. And here's a sample of what those MFN prices would look like comparing the countries with the 60% GDP to the prices paid in the United States. This compares comparable strengths and package sizes for drugs that we just selected. And we see that the lowest price discounts range from 95% for Tresiba to 58% for Keytruda. Some of these are really, I think, very surprising, and it makes you wonder if you look at other drugs, whether they are drugs that are going to have an MFP or newer drugs on the market that may not even have access within many or any of the selected countries, what that will, what those prices will end up being. I do think it's fair to say, though, that manufacturers are thinking about this MFN during their ex-US negotiations. Next slide, please. So now we're going to ask Chris some questions, and he can share his expertise and opinions on MFN and drug pricing generally. Chris, how did we get here with MFN, and why does anybody think this is a good idea?
Yeah, one of your prior slides had an interesting statistic, right? 7.9% uninsured in the US. I just tell you, in Germany, uninsured is 0.1%, right? So I'll stop there and not belabor the point on how different the economies, let's say in Europe, are as compared to the US in terms of tax rates, in terms of free tuition, in terms of government involvement in daily life, right? So why would somebody think it's a good idea to keep the US system where insurance is sort of fragmented and a lot of people get it through their employment or they don't get it, and we're going to keep all that the same, but then we'll go to places in Europe where it's single payer health insurance with virtually 100% enrollment in some cases. And we're not going to do that, but we'll just grab the price, right? So is it a good idea? I mean, that's a policy discussion, for another day. How did we get here? Well, I think it's helpful to kind of remind ourselves how this all began or how this conversation began, because that also sort of illustrates that there are kind of two strands. One is the executive taking action. Of course, there's the executive order, some other things we can talk about in terms of developments. But then let's not forget there's also a congressional, a legislative trajectory here, that began in the past and is still ongoing today. So just like a brief history, Trump in the first term, toward the end of his term, tried to implement most favored nation pricing in Medicare Part B as in boy through a payment model. And so to remind ourselves, right, under the Social Security Act, the government can waive many, many legal requirements that otherwise are in place in order to do demonstration projects where they sort of split the country into two different segments, and we'll run reimbursement in one segment as before, and this other one we'll try something new, and then there's readout, and based on how it went, maybe we'll make changes permanently based on how the model sort of performed. And so the idea under Trump 1 was to, instead of reimbursing Part B as in boy drugs as ASP plus 6, it was going to be most favored nation plus an add-on. And that was killed in court because of procedural failures when they tried to put it in place. So not because of the substance, but because of the way they tried to implement that. And so it was limited to Part B as in boy. The basket of countries is the same as Tracy, you just discussed. OECD member countries with 60% or more GDP of that in the US. So that has kind of stuck around, right? So that's sort of the executive action strand. It began in November 2020 with this failed payment model. Interesting enough, around the same time, the 116th US Congress was sitting with Senate under Republican control and House under Democratic control. The House, the Democratic House, in December 2019, actually passed H.R. 3, which is the legislation that we now know and love as the Inflation Reduction Act. So H.R. 3, just like the IRA, called for price negotiations. And just like today, the negotiated price has a cap. And so today in the IRA, the cap is based off of non-FAMP, non-federal average manufacturer price. For simplicity, we'll just say it's a wholesaler price. H.R. 3 would have capped the negotiated prices by reference to international prices, not most favored nation, right? Because most favored nation is sort of the harshest flavor where you don't take an average of prices in the basket countries, you take the lowest. HR3 would have sort of taken an average, right, from a basket of countries. But nevertheless, it's instructive that as far back as 2019, 2020, there is this weird overlap from both sides of the aisle, right? Where Trump is trying to push MFN and Part B through executive action as a regulation. Congress, meanwhile, is also in favor. Well, the Democrats in the House were also in favor of that. And then, of course, we fast forward, to this year where we had the drug pricing executive order in April, and then the MFN executive order in May. But that's kind of how we got here, and I think it's just important to remember these two things. There's a congressional pathway toward international reference pricing, and there's the executive pathway toward most favored nation.
Thanks. And so if we think about where this is currently, like what's the status? Are we all just holding our breath and waiting? Do you have any inside information, any thoughts?
Yeah, so it's interesting, when we're talking here about, well, which are the relative basket, the relevant basket countries, it sounds as if this is all coming to us in a very thoughtful manner from upon high, when really it's kind of not. So we have to understand, right, that this policy, if it becomes implemented in some fashion, which we don't know what that's going to look like really, this is going to impact billions of dollars. This is going to impact the lives of patients. This is going to impact, and I would say negatively, innovation in the US, right? And so you would think that something that is so momentous, so potentially disruptive and potentially disastrous would be, announced to the stakeholders in a very thoughtful and precise fashion. And the exact opposite is the case. So maybe let's talk briefly about these two executive orders. April 15, 2025, this was the so-called drug pricing executive order. There's a section in there, section 4, that talks about having a payment model once again. And the language here is to improve the ability of Medicare to obtain better value for high-cost prescription drugs covered by Medicare, including those not subject to the negotiation program. So if you read that language and you know now the history from Trump the first about trying to do MFN in the payment model, it starts to sound like this is kind of what he's aiming for again, although it doesn't use the word MFN, right? And then, of course, most on point is the MFN executive order from May 12th, 2025, which basically says, well, within 30 days after the date of this order, May 12th, well, now it's already past the 30 days anyway, the government is going to communicate MFN price targets to pharma companies. And then if there is not significant progress toward MFN pricing in America, then there's another parade of horribles that the executive order announces. So first, there's going to be a rulemaking plan to impose MFN pricing. Then we're going to facilitate importation of drugs to the US. We're going to do enforcement against anti-competitive practices. We're going to consider other action regarding the export of pharmaceutical drugs. And then at the end of all this, it also focuses on, to the extent consistent with law, there shall be direct-to-consumer purchasing programs for pharma manufacturers that sell their products at the MFN price. So there's a big bunch of stuff in this executive order. Let's not forget the context. On the same day that this MFN popped up, CMS quietly released the IRA negotiation guidance for iPay 2028. I don't think there was even a press release, right? So Trump made a big deal about, we're going to talk about this MFN thing. He posted something on his whatever platform the Saturday before, and nobody really picked up on the fact that, gee, it's as if Biden never left. IRA is just being implemented, just rolling forward. It's like, Biden never left that part of the administration. So there's always a bit of this, publicity stunt going on. Also, I think the same day, May 12th, was also the discussion of the free plane from Qatar. So, whatever. But everybody was hyped up about the MFN executive order. So that's kind of the context in which it kind of popped out. So where are we today? Well, the MFN is devoid of details. And since then, we've had, I would say, 3 things that matter. One is an HHS press release. And again, billions of dollars being impacted here through a press release. The press release had 4 sentences, one of which was a plug for something on Fox News. Only one sentence was substantive, and this is the sentence where we get that the basket countries are the ones in the OECD with the 60% GDP, right? So that's where that comes from. It's not in the executive order. It is only in this press release. The other thing it says in there is brand products across markets that do not currently have generic or biosimilar competition. So we kind of learn from this that we know what the basket countries are. We know that it's brand products with no generic or biosimilar. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. We'll get to that in a second here. But the other development since then has been Customs and Border Protection website, an agency I don't usually monitor in connection with my work on drug pricing, posted a statement about, well, manufacturers should ensure accurate reporting of import and export values. How that ties in with MFN, is anyone's guess, but in that same statement, there was a reference to MFN pricing and then this reminder to make sure you accurately report values. I think most recently there was something in Stat News. Stat News has claimed that there was a statement that they received from an HHS spokesperson, although that was not otherwise public, and it had direct quotes. And in there, in the direct quotes from HHS included things like, HHS is demanding that pharma companies come to the table to negotiate. All right, like who are we negotiating with, right? There's the IRA negotiation program. That's the only negotiation program I'm aware of, so who knows? And then it talks about, well, as the EO states, the Secretary will establish a mechanism through which Americans can buy these MFN price drugs directly from the manufacturer. So this is back to this direct-to-consumer marketing idea. How all that's supposed to work, I can't really tell you, but that's kind of where it is. Most recently, I think the Congressional Research Service published a report, Most Favored Nation Pricing Legal Issues, where it kind of walks through, gee, executive order, what does it really mean? How can it be challenged? So it didn't add anything new, but it's just another recent development in the conversation. But this is kind of where we are. That's what we've been told so far by the government.
So it's a lot, and yet it's so little that's definitive, right? And so if you really think about, we have MFP and then we have MFN, which is lower, which has the deeper outcomes look. I mean, at least you're submitting data for an MFP. MFN, as you said, come to the table and negotiate. What does that look like? You just each put out a card and say, here's my next bid, here's my next bid. So and how does this interplay with the rest of the prices, whether it's Medicaid mandated prices or whether it's negotiated discounts, and what does that even look like, or where do we go?
Yeah, these are all super important questions. I think there's no way to even think about today how the MFN would interplay with the other parts of the federal programs because we just don't know enough. So maybe I can walk through a little bit of what we know about the MFN policy and what we don't know. I think there are four kind of key questions. If you're a manufacturer, if you're trying to analyze a specific scenario, I have a drug in the US, it's on the market in Germany, Italy, what is this going to mean for me? There are kind of four things you want to know, right? The first thing is which drugs are even relevant for this in the US, but also outside the US. So this HHS press release tells us it's, brand drugs with no generic or biosimilar. Okay, but what about ex-US, right? What is the link? How does anybody determine that my drug in the US that has a certain brand name, maybe a certain strength, is that the same as the drug I'm selling in Germany and Italy under a different brand name, maybe in a different strength? Are those going to be tied together? Nobody knows, right? So there's no clarity on how we would identify the corresponding ex-US drug that is linked to a US drug. Next big question is which ex-US countries are relevant? Well, we kind of heard that, right? The so-called basket countries. That's the OECD country list with the 60% per capita of the US GDP. Then the third question would be which prices matter in the US and ex-US? Well, let's focus on ex-US, right? So when we say the lowest price in one of the basket countries, what is the price? Is it a price that's published in the compendium? Is it a price sort of like retail price on the street at the pharmacy counter? Nobody knows, right? Well, what I can tell you is during Trump the first, right, when he tried to do this payment model in Medicare Part B, the international prices would have come from the government kind of doing research and identifying sources, basically compendia. And there was sort of like a hierarchy of which sources they were supposed to look to. And the top of the hierarchy were compendia that had a per unit price published, and also volume of sales. So that's what they were going to look for. So not sort of like a price reporting mechanism like we have in the US. So there wasn't, at least back then, there wasn't the plan to say to the manufacturer, hey, report to me your price, and then we'll go off of that. It was basically CMS doing this research and finding these compendia. As of what it means today, we have no information. There was nothing in the executive order. Haven't had any statements, that we don't know. And then the fourth question, which is maybe among the biggest ones, is where in the US, in which channels would this MFN price apply? So the press release, and again, we're dealing off a press release here, it has the reference to all markets, right? Align prices in all markets is what is that supposed to mean, right? I couldn't tell you, right? And again, the Stat News statement focuses back on this direct-to-consumer marketing. Is that the only channel, right? Is it MFN price, but only on direct-to-consumer? There's absolutely zero clarity. And I think where that kind of leaves us is a little bit in limbo. And what are some takeaways here from the executive side of things? Well, we can't really analyze specific scenarios today, because if you say, my fact pattern is I have the US market for my drug, I got a license going on in Germany and Italy, what can I do here? What's going to happen to me? We couldn't tell you, right? Because of all these open questions. So the key thing would be to monitor these developments, attend webinars like this one, bring the right outside advisors to the table who can keep you abreast of these developments, because it could come in the form of a press release. It could come in the form of a random posting on Customs and Border Protection that you otherwise wouldn't track, right? So track these things, and then just prepare generally to understand in your organization, how are these prices set, right? Do you have a global pricing committee? Do you have operating subsidiaries that are completely independent in other markets where they do their own price setting? How do you, just understanding what your organization is doing would be super important. Maybe just for the last couple of seconds I have from my time, let's not forget the congressional stream, right? As I mentioned during the brief history, we've always had this executive sort of stream on most favored nation or reference pricing. We've also had congressional action in the past, and there is still interest there. So legislation is floating out there that wouldn't impose most favored nation, to my knowledge. I think it's all averages, right? But it is international reference pricing. And if you think back to Tracy's helpful slide that sort of compares some US prices to ex-US prices, there's a very big differential, right? So even if it's not MFN, but it's sort of like, well, we'll take the average of the prices in these basket countries, that is still a tremendous differential there from the US to ex-US. And so we have to kind of track that also, right? Could there be support in Congress for a measure like that? During the early days here of the budget discussion, when they were discussing the cuts in Medicaid, apparently there was a White House meeting where Trump said to congressional members, why don't you just do MFN and Medicaid? That's going to save us a bunch of money. That hasn't proceeded anywhere, to my knowledge. But again, we see this overlap, right? There is executive action and there could be congressional action. I think at one of the hearings, RFK and Bernie kind of buddied up to each other, and they were both like, oh yeah, MFN, that doesn't sound too bad. You never know, right? So there is still the threat of congressional action, I would say, in the mix as well.
Hey,
Thanks
before
for
we
all of
go-
that.
Yeah,
So
sorry,
I have another question too, but go ahead, Amanda.
all right, two questions come in. Sorry. Okay, so I'll just ask them at the same time. So one is, how do you think Medicare MFP will affect MFP product pricing in Medicare? And then how do you think MFP pricing will affect pharmacy reimbursement and a willingness of a pharmacy to fill MFP products?
Yeah, I mean, these are things that are hard to say, right? So I think the first question is sort of like, it's a bit of an overlap question, MFN, MFP, right? That was the first question. I can't really tell you how a most favored nation price is going to impact the other healthcare programs. And that's because we know so little about the most favored nation price. So once we know where that's supposed to apply, how that's supposed to work, I mean, would the most favored nation price be relevant for best price? Right? That could have a big impact. On the other hand, if it's direct to consumers, patients generally not in best price. So maybe there could be most favored nation price sales that do not blow up best price. I don't know, right? So it's really hard to say. To your second point, which is really now we're in IRA territory, I don't know the answer really. We'll have to see what happens next year in 2026 when the maximum fair prices kick in for the first 10 drugs. The plans, I believe, are required to have the most favored, the max fair price drugs on formulary. So there is a requirement for that to be the case. In practice, the PBMs, et cetera, are they going to favor another higher price drug because of higher service fees, et cetera? I mean, this is something that we'll have to kind of see how it shakes out. I don't want to make a prediction really at this point.
So thanks for those questions. So I actually have another question that actually relates back to manufacturer strategies. For years, there's been no actual uniform health technology assessment within the US. Obviously, there's ICER there's a little bit of a love-hate relationship there. You want to play ball as a manufacturer, but they don't always consider everything. Is now really maybe the time, rather than following an MFP or just doing MFN, following most of those countries that are listed go through the joint HTA process within the EU, or they will, is now really the time to maybe develop some type of health technology assessment that's required pre-FDA approval, during FDA approval, post-FDA approval? Does that get us to something that's more fair for everybody than linking all of these prices together around the globe?
Yeah, I think that's a conversation that's been going on, for some time. I think what might be a problem for us with that is just in what you just said, there were, a lot of terms that sort of assume that the audience understands a lot of these things. The Trump press conference about I think it was the drug pricing EO, there was a press conference, and someone asked him about PBMs and middlemen, and kind of said like, oh, PBMs, I don't know what they do, but they're rich. So that's the level that at which we're talking here, right? So I unfortunately I am of the view that some of these decision makers do not understand the US system. And you're basically saying like, well, there's this European system and they're doing it a certain way. And instead of copying their price, can we maybe copy some of these maybe smart approaches that they've put in place in Europe? Yeah, it's another conversation to watch. And if you have abilities to educate decision makers on any of these topics, I would say take those opportunities. If it's a comment letter, if you're doing some sort of lobbying activity for some other specific purpose, if you're before the decision makers or their staffers, and the staffers, of course, are typically more, in depth on these issues. If you have opportunities, educate them as much as you can, would be another suggestion there.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move into tariffs with 1R and 2Fs, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. So for anybody who's been paying attention, you probably have all learned a lot about tariffs. But the important things I think to remember are that Congress actually has been granted the authority to levy taxes, including tariffs. But Congress has also passed laws that allow the president to impose tariffs for national security reasons unilaterally without approval or even notification of Congress. That's Section 232, and it's used to investigate and determine the existence of the national security threat. Now, we have heard that the Section 232 investigation by the administration was initiated and completed, and yet what we have not heard is what the outcome of that is. A recent court decision by the Federal International Trade Court, it's been a few weeks now, said that the current economic circumstances were not sufficient for the president to usurp congressional power and unilaterally impose other tariffs, but he would still have 232 power. That decision has been stayed and until the administration gets to present their case on appeal in June. And yet 232 is out there. The results of that investigation are known to some people, just not public. And yet when we look at what the impact on pharma would be, we know that there's a significant number of active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, that are manufactured outside the US. So only 4% or so are produced domestically. thinking about how do you change that supply chain. There was a reason initially why these ingredients were produced outside the US. And so all of that will take time and money. Um, and so what we're hearing is that manufacturers have begun to move significant quantities of final product into US warehouses. So that's one way to deal with this. But across the board, when you're manufacturing and your APIs are coming from outside the US, there's a serious question as to, how you get them to the US without a significant tariff, and also are the tax policies that the US provides for people for manufacturers in this space to actually produce in the US. So with that, I'm happy to move to questions for David Murphy. Um, David, tell us more about Section 232. How common is it? How has it been used in the past? What does this look like for pharmaceuticals?
Well, interesting. Congress going back to the 30s had always given the president authority to reduce duties based upon international trade agreements, which, resulted in a number of different situations where duties did come down over time. But in 1962, they added this provision, Section 232, to the Trade Act, which basically gave him the authority for national security reasons to impose tariffs and other activities, quotas, etc., to ensure that we have critical supplies, things like that. And going back in history, these have been used in a number of different situations. Probably the most one that everybody remembers is during the oil crisis in the 70s. Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Carter all jumped on 232 for petroleum and those sort of products. Since then, it's been used or invoked several times, but rarely actually implemented because of either, with Reagan, it was a negotiation with the Japanese that sort of forestalled any 232 action. And later ones, even after the investigations were done, the administration decided that no action was necessary. So it's been there. It's been utilized, but again, very sparingly, and in true situations that were perceived as a threat to our national security.
And so what actually comes to mind, thank you for that. What actually comes to mind is the recent steel and aluminum Section 232. Have there been any others recent? Because I don't remember the 70s, unfortunately.
Well,
So,
okay. Yeah,
I mean, I do, but it's more about elementary school. So
yeah, looking back, it was iron ore under Bush, crude oil, uranium, gears and gearing, plastic injection molding machines. It's been all over the place, but it's never been more utilized than starting in 2018 with the
interesting.
Trump administration, where they aggressively have gone against basic steel and aluminum forms, and then now the derivatives, which is goods made from those, which can affect a wide range of products.
Interesting. Thank you. So both the US and the EU participate in the 1994 Agreement on Trade in Pharmaceutical Products, which eliminates the tariffs and other duties on a significant number of pharmaceutical products. How does 232 jive with that, or trump it, or, how does that even work?
Okay, so that agreement, again, under other laws passed by Congress, allowed the president to reduce duties, and he did so under that agreement. The president at the time did so under that agreement, and has basically resulted in where we are today. But 232 and the World Trade Organization agreement that that is sort of the parent organization that this pharmaceutical agreement was negotiated under, allows for exceptions for national security. And this was a whole issue that came up with the steel and aluminum tariffs during the first administration. There was a WTO complaint. Whether the US would even listen to a decision of the WTO these days is a different issue. But, they basically, while they recommended against it, there was really, the United States position is, well, we have it for national security, we can use it. And that's where, their position is today.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it would move forward regardless of that agreement.
It's going to move forward. It's going to be subject to challenges like all the administration's actions have been. But, it is something that even if condemned internationally under the international organizations, I don't see the administration backing off on it at all.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if we think about the tariffs on APIs, what could be the impact of that? And do you see a difference because of the unavailability of some of these ingredients in the US? I mean, this requires some, I think maybe mind reading into implementation, which is kind of scary, but also I feel like necessary because of the dearth of information.
Right. So the whole pharmaceutical and pharmaceutical ingredient products investigation, they solicited comments through May 8th. Hopefully they're evaluating those. They're supposed to by law. And they have until 270 days, which I think gets us to, somewhere in December or January, when they must make a decision. They could make a decision before then. In that process, they will be evaluating criteria such as that, based upon some of the comments I've seen. And hopefully, saner heads will prevail and say, we can't just force a lot of this onshore. But you're going to, there's going to be some wrangling back and forth in that, I'm sure, internally, and behind the scenes by lobbyists, etc. Even though the comments have closed at this point, we're well aware that, lobbying the administration seems to have one way to get the ear of somebody on some of these issues.
So that actually leads into my next question. Would there be a way to have varying Section 232 tariffs by product, by country, by class of product? How many different ways could they split this?
Well, the statute just provides it can impose tariffs. It doesn't say how in many ways. So there could be some discrimination among groups about certain things, get higher duties, other ones don't. They did that with the steel and aluminum. Steel was originally 25 and aluminum was 10. He's done that in the 301 investigations with China, everything from 25 to 7.5%. So it's quite possible that they could discriminate and say, okay, this class of products is this is that, this is that. Whether they have the capacity to understand which should get which, and the information to do that, is something that is yet to be seen.
I mean, I guess they could also do it based on country, since that would be the origin of the national security threat. That said, I don't know what the difference would be between, say, Ireland and the UK versus India. So they could do it by country it's coming from as well, I guess.
Yeah, in the steel and aluminum, they did that as well. Well, again, it came down to let's make a deal. If the country can make a deal, they'll get a quota or a break that will allow them, let's say, a certain amount of APIs in during an annual period. And that could break down country by country. I mean, we know the UK's already got their deal in place, whether that's got some sort of side agreement ready to go on pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical ingredients, we don't know. But, that's quite possible. Japan is out there negotiating like crazy. But we hear the EU is not being cooperative, or at least according to the administration, in all of these negotiations. So he's been threatening, action against them. So it's, again, a wait and see sort of situation, see where it shakes out.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And I guess, my final question that I have is, like, how much could a tariff be? Are we talking about something similar to what has been said for other goods or other countries, 10 to 20% or 50 or 100% if it's from China, or what? I mean, do you have any idea what they might be thinking? Because on one hand, we have the whole MFN discussion and we're so outraged that we pay more for drugs. Well, if you add a 50% tariff on everything that's coming out of factories in Ireland, that's not lowering the price of drugs, right?
Correct.
So
Correct.
like where do we think this falls?
Well, first you start with the list of products, which, they haven't published the final list of products that they're going to do this, but Secretary Lutnick and President Trump have said, there was a thing called the Annex 2 to the IEEPA reciprocal tariffs that were set aside from being subject to reciprocal tariffs at this point, included pharmaceutical products and their ingredients. So Lutnick has said that's probably where we'll start. So those are the products that are likely to get hit. The next will be, what the percentage is. Trump has said as high as 50 because that would be a meaningful tariff. It would, impose action. But it's more likely going to be in the neighborhood of 10 to 25 is what we're hearing. Again, that as we get closer to the final report of the Department of Commerce on the 232 investigation, we'll get more details on that. And remember, the final report of the Department of Commerce isn't the be all and end all. The president can take action, and he may adopt the report, or he may modify and go even higher or lower, depending upon what they see as necessary.
Via tweet.
Yes. Yeah. Get your X account or your Truth Social up to date. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to take questions now for, you can go to the next slide, Amanda. On the tariff section or pricing policies, just have anybody in the audience has questions? Amanda,
I have
anything
one
there in the
thing.
chat?
Yeah, I just have one thing to add. I mean, Tracy, you just made this comment that, well, if we're going to get the tariffs, what about drug prices? I just want to remind us of where we are with inflation penalties in the US, right? So we've had a Medicaid rebate tied to price increases that outpace inflation since the 90s, right? So we've had that for the longest time. It was expanded to generics a number of years ago, right? So we've had that in Medicaid. Well, with IRA, we now have penalties in parts D and in B if increases outpace inflation. And what's really nefarious is the partisan dog rebate is not tied to Part D increases. It's tied to average manufacturer price, which measures commercial prices. So, we've had Walmart get in trouble for saying like, well, we'll jack up prices so that the duties can be, pushed through to the consumer. It's a question whether that's even possible in the pharmaceutical industry, because if prices are raised faster than inflation, it's going to trigger these inflation penalties. As like I said, those penalties now have always applied in Medicaid. They now apply in Medicare D and B. So, more to see how that plays out.
Well, and I guess that's a good point, because now if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly is, what's the AWP if it's set at $100, but there's a 20% tariff, right? Have you raised the AWP or the WAC, or has that been done outside of your control? And then is that the pharmacy reimbursement number that's passed through? But are you penalized for an increase in the WAC that you didn't voluntarily take?
Well, I mean, the decision point for any company there is, do I eat the tariffs that I'm now paying, right? And cut it to my bottom line, but the consumer end price stays the same? Or do I not do that and increase the consumer end price? Or do I do a combination of those things, right? So, I mean, the WAC only changes if the manufacturer decides to change the WAC, right? So if I'm a manufacturer and I'm now being hit with this tariff, it's my decision, right? Do I push up the WAC? Do I eat this extra cost? How do I slice and dice it, right? So I'm just saying, unlike in other industries where the question becomes a business question and what can the consumer market sustain, so on and so forth, I think pharma companies are hemmed in because the IRA kind of set up these boundaries by expanding inflation rebates into the Medicare space. You know, it might be tough. It might be tough for a company to make this decision to either eat the tariff or increase price. But if you increase price, you then get slammed with inflation rebates. So you know, tough decisions might be ahead there.
Well, and it would be, I mean, large too, even at 10%. You know, that's not a normal quarterly CPI penalty that you end up taking. You know, you might take, depending on the CPI, 2 to 4% on average based on company pricing decisions. 10% increase to take an 8 or a 7% hit that goes on eternally and is cumulative. Crazy.
You know, all this gets put in the background that the administration has said time and time again that the foreign suppliers are paying these tariffs, which is a misconception, because while they may be eating a portion of it by reducing prices, it's getting passed along down the line one way or another.
Right. And in this case, it's, you know, it's X company's manufacturing facility in Ireland importing it into their warehouse in New York City. It's all the same. And
Yeah.
and how much can you bear?
Yeah. And Chris mentioned about customs warning about values. I mean, we're in an enhanced enforcement mode with customs issues. And intercompany pricing has always been an issue that customs has looked at. But, you know, price reductions that can't be justified in an intercompany situation can trigger a lot of problems. So you got to be careful there. We're seeing all sorts of activity in the field in various industries.
Yeah. Yep. Amanda, any questions in the chat?
I have two questions. The first one is MFN going to stay at the list price reference level, or will there be pressure to get at net price levels in OECD reference countries?
Yeah, that's what we don't know, right? So this also gets into interesting questions of what are the public prices, right? So in Europe, the way this sometimes works is, you know, there is a list price, which is already usually quite lower than the US. But then there's sort of like a government type of rebate that the government collects. And in many countries, my understanding is, you know, although I am from Germany, my legal education is all US, right? So my European experience is from flying home to hang out with my parents and all that good stuff. But my high level understanding is in many European countries, there is still a list price, and then there is sort of like a government mandated payment, and that is not always public. So then the question is, well, what is the MFN going to be based on? Is it going to be based off of that published list price, which, like I said already, is usually quite a bit lower than the US? Or is it going to be that list price minus this government rebate, right? And we just don't know, right? We just don't know the answer. I mean, like think of it in the US, right? In the US, the federal programs tie their reimbursement rates and other things to US market prices. And how does the government understand the US market price? It's through the price reporting that we all do and love every month, every quarter, every year, right? AMP, best price, ASP, non-FAMP, all that good stuff, right? So there is no mechanism like that for prices in Europe. So how would the MFN be established, right? What is the formula? So you know, so the question kind of is sort of like 5 steps ahead, right? Like how would the MFN be adjusted over time? Would it be like a periodic tracking of prices in Europe? We don't know. We don't even know, again, like which prices would be the ones that would be looked at, right? Is it going to be, again, sort of like compendia postings? Could it be something else? You know, we just don't know at this point.
Okay, thanks. Okay, the next question is, could the administration add the MFN price in as the new ceiling for IRA MFP? And if something like that happened, would that require new legislation or just a guidance change?
So that's going to be legislation, because the way all the IRA stuff, with some exceptions, is based on the statutory text itself. So the ceiling for the negotiated price, which like I mentioned, is tied to non-FAMP, right? Like it's a wholesaler metric, basically. That is all in the law. So if there was a desire to implement most favored nation, by, going back to HR3, right? Because HR3 had the price cap by reference not to MFN, but still to international reference pricing. If there were to be a desire to do that, that would require legislation. And so again, we need to kind of bear in mind these two tracks, right? There's the congressional track for things, there's the Trump executive track, and these two could overlap. I mean, in the pricing executive order, in terms of IRA, there's something about, eliminating the pill penalty, right? To align the period to negotiation, which is 7 years for small molecule, 11 years for biologics, to align the small molecule 7 years, bring it up to 11 years, right? That's a change that requires congressional action, and the EO says, the secretary is supposed to work with Congress to make that happen. So these two things could at some point align, right? Like I also mentioned, Trump did suggest that maybe we could do MFN and Medicaid to have a bunch of savings. That hasn't apparently had any traction, but those things could kind of come together. I'll mention one more point on that. I'm a little surprised no one has asked about the challenges. How can we challenge this if it happens? I think David mentioned a little bit about it. Here, I think it's going to be very interesting to understand this difference between congressional action versus executive action, right? So remember, Trump the first, his most favored nation pricing model, Medicare Part B, was killed because the regulation was defective procedurally. So if it's through rulemaking, there's a lot more opportunities for comment, for involvement, for knowing what's coming down the line. If Congress passes a law like they did with the IRA, bam, it just hits us, and there it is, right? Congress has the authority. They make the laws. And so then in terms of challenges, it's much easier typically or at least there are usually more grounds for challenging executive action, like the executive order itself, if necessary, like a possible rulemaking. But look at how the IRA litigation is going, right? It's tedious. It takes a long time. So in a way, worst case would be international reference pricing or MFN pricing in a law from Congress. That would be probably the worst case scenario.
Okay, so we are almost at time. I've actually had a good number of questions coming in, but everyone's been anonymous. So if you would like us to follow up with an answer to your question, you can either chat me individually here, or if you'd like to email me, you can do like info@magnoliamarketaccess.com, and we can get back to you with answers if we don't get to your question today, because these are all really good questions. I'm going to end. There was one about like what's available in terms of an ex-US strategy for manufacturers, in terms of like just removing prices, like what could they do to kind of work some of these things, taking things off the market, negotiate with ex-US governments, like where do you all see some of this happening outside of the US to affect what ends up happening in the US?
Yeah, I mean, part of the noise, well, I shouldn't say noise, but part of the policy statements from Trump administration have been like, well, these other countries are freeloading, so they have to increase price. Shockingly, these other countries all have laws and legal systems of their own. And in many cases, the prices in these countries are not randomly set by somebody who decides to set government prices. So I think it's somewhat unlikely that the prices in, say European countries are going to suddenly jump up to align with US prices just because legally that's impossible. And it's impossible for other reasons, just realistically. So then the next question is like, well, if I have this hypothetical, if I have a US drug and I have a license in Germany and one in Italy, what do I do with that? I think the first thing you have to do is pick up the phone and call the antitrust counsel of your choice, because decisions like I'm all of a sudden going to decide to kill my drug in ex-US markets, I'm all of a sudden going to do these actions, all that has potential repercussions. So I would say start with that as you evaluate strategies.
No. All right, so we are right up on the hour. I've gotten some really great questions, so hopefully we'll have some people email us and we can get you answers. Just so you know, this comes on our website. We post the slides as well as the recording. Happy to answer any questions afterward and also connect you with Chris or David if you have additional questions. Next month, we're going to get a little bit into evidence and value and talk about cross-functional collaboration and how working across company lines, we've always had a lot of firewalls between commercial and scientific at pharma, and especially like bigger pharma companies, and how we have to kind of navigate that to make sure that we're putting the right messaging to industry. And as we say, everything is how we end up getting access to the patient. So that will be our topic next month. And we We also love if you send us topics. We might actually just end up putting like a poll up as well for people who have a topic that they're interested in, want to hear more about. We are always happy for ideas for how to run these webinars and different people we can bring to you and different insights we can bring to you. So thank you all so much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Chris. Thank you,
Thank you.
Tracy. And it's been a pleasure. And again, feel free to send in questions. I put our email address in the chat for everybody if you'd like to find out more. So have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for
Thank
having me.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.